You're a prosecutor, a process guy, a former Fed, after all, the likes of which we have on this broadcast all the time, and a patriot. Are you not remotely curious what everyone is lying about? Are you not remotely curious why there were Russians in Cleveland at the GOP convention?
Well, listen, I'm not remotely curious about the Russians in Cleveland because there were all kinds of foreigners in Cleveland, as there always are at every national convention. So that doesn't bother me. The lying bothers me a lot as somebody who, as a former U.S. attorney, hated when people lied to us and misled us because it cost us time and money and faith in the system. Now, I also know as U.S. attorney that dumb people and bad people lie for reasons that make no sense.
But they're all lying about one thing, and they're all in service to one guy.
But that's what they're being asked about. And my point to you would be, if you asked them about the weather, some of these people would lie. They're just not good people. Mike Flynn's not a good guy.
But it's not.
Paul Manafort's not a good guy. Look at how many bits of evidence do you need, from his business dealings to his tax dealings to hiding money overseas, that Paul Manafort is just a bad guy.
But Mueller doesn't run the National Weather Service. This is the Russia investigation,
right,
because it's Russia and because we think their thumb was on the scale in our last presidential election.
Sure, and they tried to they interfered with the election. They tried to move it. I don't think they had any measurable effect on the election at all, given what they did and how much they spent and all the rest of that. The problem with what they did was, we don't want anybody messing with our election for 1 minute, let alone for however much time they tried to devote to it and try to infect it. So all this stuff is bad. That's why I've all along said everybody should leave Bob Mueller alone, let him do his work, and let him come to a conclusion. And I've told the president that, and anybody else who'll listen, because in the end, I think he's a fair guy. I think he's a direct guy, and I think he'll come to some conclusions. I don't know what they're going to be, but he'll come to them.
Will you, as a former Fed, and one of the stories people will learn is your years as U.S. attorney, vow on this broadcast in front of the world and Donald Trump and whoever else is watching that you, Chris Christie, will accept the findings of the Mueller report?
Sure. I'll accept the findings of the Mueller report as long as he's got the evidence to support it. And I will assume that Bob will have that if he put it out, because he's a pro. But I will tell you one thing. One of the first things that has made me uncomfortable about the Mueller thing was the Stone arrest.
Why is that? Now, you have carried out arrests as a U.S. attorney.
Many times.
You know standards and practices.
Standards and practices on that is, if there's not evidence of imminent destruction of evidence.
Which we don't know.
Well, he said that there wasn't, and that there were no weapons. Now, whenever I did a raid like that as U.S. attorney, it was because of weapons. If we knew through our investigation that someone had even a weapon in their house, a firearm, then we sent people in that way for two reasons. One, to make sure that our FBI agents were not harmed, and two, to try to make sure that the person didn't harm himself or herself. Because if you're coming in to be arrested, that's a traumatic moment, and some people in the past have turned to suicide in that moment. So you try to go in with that kind of force to be able to do that. I don't see evidence of either one of those things here.
Do you think we'll find out about it someday?
Well, I think we will. Lindsey Graham's talking about wanting to ask some questions to the FBI director about whether he authorized it, and if so, on what basis. And I think those questions should be asked, because anything that we do, whether it's tweets from the president attacking an investigation or overzealous enforcement by law enforcement that diminishes people's faith in the justice system, is a bad thing for our democracy.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.